Hi folks, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing a comparison between the Zen Art Cold Press watercolor paper. So for this review, I will be doing 5 basic tests and then doing a small painting using watercolors and a micron pen. So before we get started, please hit the likes button and subscribe so I can keep bringing you more content. Okay, so the first paper I looked at was the Canson XL Cold Press watercolor paper. The 5 tests I did on this paper were a dry stroke, a gradient, a wet on wet technique, and lightning watercolor, and then finally a tape test. For those of you just learning about watercolor painting, a dry stroke is when you put down the watercolor paint without adding additional water to your brush. It creates a very thick consistency of color. The second thing I attempted was a gradient test. A gradient test is when you blend colors to transition from one color to another, or to go from darker to lighter with one color. As you can see, that seemed to look pretty okay on here, but we'll come back to this when finished to see how it looks when it all dries. The third test I did was a wet on wet technique. Here, I laid down a lot of water and then added drops of watercolor paint to it. This didn't really spread as much as I was expecting. And the next thing I did was try a dry stroke and then try to lift the paint both using a tissue paper and then using my brush. I noticed that while the tissue paper did lift the water quite well, there was a lot of peeling when I tried to use my watercolor brush to lift the paint off the Canson paper. And finally, I did the tape test. And this was mainly to see if there would be any issues using the washi tape with the paper. Would the paint bleed through, or would the paper rip off when trying to tear the tape? So I went ahead and painted over it. And so we'll see after the paint dries how this comes out. So then I moved on to the Zen Art Cold Press watercolor paper. So with this, I did the same tests. I started off with the dry stroke, and I noticed that my colors flowed a bit more smoothly onto the paper and my lines appeared pretty clean. For the gradient test, my gradient also appeared to glide on more smoothly. This might have been because I was using a little bit more water, but I liked the way that it looked. And when I was using the wet on wet technique, I also noticed that the color spread more easily than it did for the Canson paper. The tissue removed about the same amount of paint when I did the lifting technique on the lifting test on the paper. But I didn't see as much peeling from the paintbrush when I tried to lift the color off as I did when I was using the Canson paper. And lastly, I did the tape test using the same orange color. When I went back, I definitely noticed a difference in the way the two colors handled the gradients and the wet on wet technique. When you compare the two papers side by side, you can see that the Canson paper has more streaks in it when you look at the gradient than the Zen Art paper, which went on more smoothly. And for the wet on wet technique, the colors tended to just remain in the same spot when I dropped them on the Canson paper, whereas they spread out more on the Zen Art paper. And lastly, for the tape test, The tape came off easily on both and didn't leave as many marks. However, you can see that on the Canson paper, the color appeared more streaky, whereas the Zen art paper appeared more smooth. Okay, so next I created the same hands watercolor painting using slightly different colors on both the Canson and the Zen art paper. I definitely painted with a thicker layer of paint on the Canson watercolor paper, and the colors were thick and bright. I was a little bit lighter initially when laying down the colors on the Zen art paper, but I actually felt like I had a smoother experience with it. It absorbed the water well, and I felt like I had to use less of the color. After the initial watercolor for both, I went in and I added lines around the hands to test out my micron pen. I like using a combination of pens and watercolors when I personally do paintings, so I wanted to see how the marker would land on the pages. They seem to show similarly on both pieces. Then I went into the Zen art once again and made the colors a little bit darker so that they would be comparable across the papers. The pen marks didn't bleed when I went in with the paint, which was really nice. After they both dried, I noticed that the Canson strokes appeared a lot more streaky in comparison to the Zen art ones. And overall, I think in terms of experience, I felt like I had a smoother time with the Zen art paper than I did with the Canson paper. Now, for my recommendation, I would say that the Canson watercolor paper is definitely not bad for what you get. On Amazon, you can get a Canson watercolor paper set with 30 sheets for about $8 or $9, whereas the Zen Art Supplies watercolor paper comes in at about $36, and they're more part of a professional. So, beginner painter, I would recommend starting with the Canson watercolor paper. But if you're interested in leveling up and want to try nicer materials, I think the Zen Art watercolor paper is worth a try. Thank you for watching the review. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you next time.